Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the host of this show and a potential Green Party candidate for governor of Maryland in 2026. I'm using this show to highlight interesting people and ideas that help me and you to understand what is happening and what is possible. You can learn more about the campaign by going to gogreen2026.com. Guests on this show do not necessarily support my campaign or the Green Party. They've agreed to come on to discuss ideas and issues. And of course, click the subscribe button on YouTube so you can keep up to date with this podcast. Hello and welcome to tonight's show. Johns Hopkins University is an immensely powerful force in Baltimore and in Maryland. They have a $10 billion endowment, own hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property, and received a green light for their own private armed police force that will patrol the streets of Baltimore. Almost anywhere you go in Baltimore is in the shadow of Johns Hopkins University. Yet the power has generated significant resistance. Earlier in the season, we talked to Andrew Einem regarding the Johns Hopkins grad student unionization effort. Since that conversation, the Johns Hopkins administration and the Teachers and Researchers United Union have reached a tentative agreement around a historic contract. Meanwhile, a group of unions and grassroots and community groups have banded together to form a coalition, With Us For Us, that is petitioning for a Baltimore City Charter amendment that would create a community wealth building fund funded by renegotiating the payments in lieu of taxes agreement that allows Hopkins to pay a sliver of the amount they would pay if they paid their fair share of taxes. These struggles are not unique. Around the country, big urban universities are amassing tremendous wealth and power, and around the country, movements of resistance have arisen to force these universities to use that power to benefit workers, students, communities, and the cities they are in. Tonight's guest, Davarian L. Baldwin, is an internationally recognized scholar, author, and public advocate. He currently serves as the Paul E. Raether Distinguished Professor of American Studies and founding director of the Smart Cities Research Lab at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. His academic and political commitments have focused on global cities and particularly the diverse and marginalized communities that struggle to maintain sustainable lives in urban locales. Baldwin is the award-winning author of several books, most recently In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, and served as the consultant and text author for The World of the Harlem Renaissance, a Jigsaw Puzzle. His commentaries and opinions have featured in numerous outlets from NBC News, BBC, PBS, to USA Today, The Washington Post, and Time Magazine. Baldwin was a featured guest on the HULU series The Conversations Project, and in 2022, he was named a Freedom Scholar by the Marguerite Casey Foundation for his work. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm excited to get to do this conversation, and let's get right into it. What does the Smart City Research Lab do? When I heard the name, I thought that was something that I wanted to hear way more about.
Okay, cool. So yeah, the Smart Cities Research Lab, it started out as basically a clearinghouse of information about kind of the work that came out of my book In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower. And from that work, we primarily focus on researching and consulting on best practices for building equitable urban communities, with a particular focus on higher education-driven urban development. Most of the people you probably think when you hear SMART, you think of probably, what the primary focus has been on technological innovation and infrastructural design. So being smarter means being more technologically savvy. But my work, we pointed out, is that, in that equation, what about people? What about the human scale? And so the notion of calling this a Smart Cities Research Lab is directly a kind of a jab at the way we understand SMART as being technology and infrastructure, without a focus on people. And so we center, we prioritize, we highlight, we put at the core a people-oriented approach to urban and economic development and growth. And so we have been doing this work now for 3.5 years all over the country.
Excellent. And I noticed that when I went to look up Smart Cities Research Lab, I got a couple of things that were called like smart cities, and we're talking about how you grow the technology sector and all of that. So I appreciate that is a direct response to that, because I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But now that I know it's a direct response, that makes a lot more sense. And, I think that it's exciting work, and I'm excited to see that lab grow and see more come out of it. And on May 1st, you're going to be in the Baltimore area at the University of Baltimore in a conversation with Dr. Nicole King as part of the University of Maryland Baltimore County Spring Humanities Forum. The event is entitled When Your City Becomes a Campus, What Good is Higher Education for Our Cities? Without giving away all the best parts, can you let us know what the talk will be about and why people should attend?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm really excited to be in Baltimore in May coming up. And so I spent some time there, and it's important to come back at this current moment, especially as you mentioned, with considering the With Us For Us campaign. So this talk will put at the center and think through, current developments in Baltimore that deal with university-based urban development, whether you're thinking about Eager Park in East Baltimore, or the University of Maryland Bio Park in West Baltimore. These two developments put like innovation development at the center of economic growth. And I am going to use those two projects to trouble, to question, to think differently about what does it mean when institutions of higher learning become the dominant employer, real estate holder, healthcare provider, and even policing agent in your community. What are the possibilities, but what are the pitfalls when that becomes the dominant anchor and economic engine and driver of your political economy in your community? And so I'm going to, go very specific to Baltimore to then branch out to talk about how what's happening in Baltimore is part of a much larger national and increasingly international story.
Yeah, that's excellent. I can't wait for the event. I'm really excited to see it, and I appreciate the work that Dr. King does, and I just look forward to seeing the two of you in conversation. We'll make sure that we share all the information about how folks can attend that event and the comments, and in any notes we send out for it. And I look forward to seeing you there. And tonight, let's try to dive into parts of it that aren't exactly the same, but are adjacent to it. And not knowing what you all are doing there, I kind of tried to craft it as hopefully not repeating all the same stuff, but touching on similar themes. So let's start with the history of this. In the book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, you trace the evolution of the urban university into the dominant and political force that it is today. How is it different today than it was 20 or 40 years ago? How did this happen, and what political and economic forces drove this?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of people might not know, but especially urban higher education during the era of the revolutionary era of the 1960s and 70s, students and community groups had protested. The racial and economic demographic of higher education changed drastically in the time period. And what those students, primarily women, working class, and students of color, brought to the table was an argument for not just free higher education, but also open admissions, that it was the responsibility of higher education to prepare your neighborhoods, your community citizenry for the next generation of career and economic development. And so it was students already seeing in the 60s and 70s that we were going to be moving towards an information and knowledge sector economy, that factories were going to be shipped to the global South. They already could see this. And so they were saying, in this process of retooling, we need to shift what the responsibility of higher education is to prepare these next generations for that new economy. And so they argued for not just free education, but for open admissions, and that it was higher education's responsibility to train citizens for that new generation of thinking and learning and working. And so that was a process that went on for at least 20 or 30 years. But at the same time, you had powerful forces, primarily at the federal and state level, who were worried that this was opening the door to training what Ronald Reagan, when he was then California governor, his education secretary called training a new radical proletariat. And that was not a compliment. and so at this period, we begin to witness a powerful divestment from higher education at the same time that people were training and calling for expansion of higher education. And we've received that moment where even public universities went from, say, between 50 and 70% of their annual operating budget coming from state contributions to currently now between more like 20 and 12%. Some arguing that, public universities should only be called public in name only because they are not receiving, they're receiving very little money from state contributions, in very sharp contrast to the way it used to be. So in the face of that, by the time we get to the 80s and 90s, we witness higher education, both public and private, being forced to, but also leaning into the idea of becoming much more entrepreneurial in focus, trying to find new revenue streams to substantiate, to solidify their operating budget, their work. And so this is where we find higher education moving into a whole new era or new areas of investment, things that we now know as common sense, but were not so, say, 30 years ago. So this means universities expanding their real estate footprint, buying up properties in the surrounding neighborhoods where before they had kind of created a bunker mentality and turned away from the urban environs. We find universities moving away from tenure track professors and job security towards now 70% of university instructors are adjunct or contingent, what we call glorified gig workers. We find universities shifting away from community hospitals and clinics in their medical areas and leaning into things like lucrative, high-level, high-profile cancer research, boutique services like plastic surgery and things of that nature, and shutting down public community-based health outreach, when in fact that is a precondition for academic medical centers tax exemptions. And we also find universities ramping up their police forces to protect the hoarding of this primarily public wealth. You talk about the neoliberal era. It's not like universities aren't receiving public money, but they're receiving it in more indirect ways through either tax exemptions or through student loans or through federal grants for their research and development. So we see the shift of higher education being from much more of meeting its public good mission of serving the public to being much more oriented around private investment, wealth hoarding, looking at consumers and their surrounding neighborhoods as commercial markets that can be exploited for profit accumulation. So yes, it's an era that we know well, but it's also important to know that it wasn't always this way.
Right, and in fact, there was a moment of possibility in the 60s and the 70s in which campuses were radical, yes. And that moment of possibility is part of what ushered in this era.
Yes.
They looked and they said,
era. Exactly.
We don't want this power being directed this way. Let's figure out how to redirect it.
That's right.
And,
yes.
and how did the elected leaders, both in the cities and at the state and federal level, sort of react to this? Obviously, not everybody was the same, but what was the sort of general response amongst electeds at the time?
Yeah, great question. So at the federal level, which is really important, this is the rise in '65 of the Higher Education Act. And it's important about that is that there was a moment where people were actually discussing very clearly that higher education should be directly funded. So there should be a funding of schools themselves. But certain elected leaders felt that sounded too much like communism during the Cold War. And so instead they turned towards student loans, which helped give rise to the student debt crisis that we currently face, as a more consumer-based, individualized approach to funding higher education, which then left students prey to a number of private or for-profit lending institutions. That's on one side. Another side is that in the 50s and 60s, we began to witness the rise of the urban renewal era, where because of suburbanization, urban communities were left divested. And so you had city leaders attempting to figure out ways to reconnect suburban workers and residents to the downtown core in ways that demolished or bypassed downtown or urban core Black and brown communities, building highways and bridges and tunnels running right through many times thriving Black and brown communities. But the part we don't know much about, or that we're beginning to learn about more because I'm trying to help with others amplify this other story, is that there were urban universities and colleges that lobbied for a change to the higher education. I'm sorry, the Housing Act of 1949 that allowed universities to become the friendly face of this urban renewal era. So what that meant was, with this thing that we shorthand as the 112 credits program, that if you put a university at the front of your urban renewal project, for every $2 contributed by for every dollar contributed by the city, $2 would come from the federal government. Mm-hmm. And so this happened and allowed, which I was talking about earlier, kind of leaning towards earlier, where universities were the leading edge in demolishing thriving Black and brown communities and creating institutional bunkers and walls around their campuses to create separation and security at the very moment that Black and brown migrants were coming into the city, the period that we call the urban crisis. This became a moment of protection. So this we see as a coordination between the federal government with the Higher Education Act, between the federal government and local governments and universities with this change to the Housing Act of 1949 and the rise of the 112 credits program. We also see this as a period with the ramping up of funding of campus police. Campus police also exploded this time period as a response to urban uprisings and protests on campuses. So all these things kind of converge around this moment when Black, brown, working class white people were actually reimagining higher education as a site of democratic possibility in broad and robust ways on one side. And on the other side, doing that because they were moving into these neighborhoods surrounding campuses, trying to make a life as new residents of the cities. Mm-hmm. And so the federal government, states, and local government and universities had a direct hand in trying to figure out ways how to protect their wealth, how to create separation, how to demolish these communities in order to create new economic arrangements that would maintain their status, reputation, their wealth, to the detriment of these new residents, these new citizens.
Yeah, and I ran for state delegate in East Baltimore in 2018, and I ran with a guy named Glenn Ross, who's a longtime community advocate and environmental justice focused guy over there in East Baltimore. And he was telling me stories about how they would go into these meetings with Hopkins, and Hopkins would have these plans for what they were planning to do with East Baltimore. And a lot of it has actually manifested itself into, the East Baltimore campus and things like that. Yeah. But the residents would look at these maps and be like, where are we going to go? Mm-hmm. And Hopkins would assure them that they were going to take care of that. But, we can talk a little bit about how that actually worked out. But I think there's been a lot of folks who have seen this threat coming for a long time and seen the role that the universities have played, Black and brown folks in those communities surrounding them. Right. And it's, seeing this is a long struggle. It's not brand new. It didn't just start. It's a decades-long era to tilt the universities in these directions. And I guess one question that I would ask here is, in addition to those laws that you talked about, are there any other key laws and policies at the federal level that enabled this? I know in the book you talk a little bit about things that protect patents and things like that. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. So as we probably all know, about 90% of the research and development that goes on in college campuses is federally funded. Mm-hmm. And people thought that because it's federally funded, the research that was produced, whether it if it goes to support, say, products in pharmaceuticals or health sciences or even military weaponry, that research should remain open. It should not be allowed to be privatized because it's federally funded. Mm-hmm. But a group of universities and lobbyists got together in the late 1970s to ultimately help craft what became the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act. Now get this, which allowed for universities to take advantage of federally funded money to produce research and development that could then be brought to market and come back to the university in the form of royalties, because they can convert into private intellectual property on the parts of universities, so basically monetize federally funded research and development to the benefit of universities. And so this initiated and accelerated a whole process of universities creating what we call technology transfer divisions, where they would go out and try to exploit both the research of faculty and the labor of graduate students and related workers to do this work that they could then convert from research into IP that could be sold on market and come back to the university in the form of royalties as another kind of entrepreneurial emphasis. And so this is what helped give rise to what we now have all over the country, the Eager Parks, the University of Maryland, Baltimore Biopark, the rise of Wexford Science Technology, which is a company that exclusively focuses on partnerships. This is a development company that focuses on, and they are based in Baltimore. This is a company that they exclusively focus on university or academic medical research park development, what they call knowledge communities, all over the country. And part of the reason is that when you bring together the Bayh-Dole Act, which allows universities to privatize publicly funded research, on top of the fact that university campus land is property tax exempt. These two forces together help produce a lucrative financial shelter for both universities and for their private third-party partners when research and development for the private investor is done on campus land with the suppressed wages of graduate workers and researchers. This is a very powerful thing. Another I got caught up in the policy, but another law that's important, or policy is important, is the 2005 decision of Kelo versus New London. Now, why this is important is because it deals with eminent domain. And so historically, eminent domain said that, you know, the state, the government could seize properties of private owners if that property was going to be used for the public use. So like a bridge, a tunnel, a school, a waste treatment plant, something of this nature. But what Kelo versus City of New London did was that it said that the government cannot just simply take advantage of private properties and transfer it to, say, private investors, not just for public use, but simply for public good. Mm-hmm. And this is important because it meant that even if you were, utilizing the properties to do some innovation project like a biotech park or something of that nature, you could argue that, well, the jobs that are created, the wealth that's hoarded on these campuses, you could argue that is for the public good, even though the residents who either lived in the area or don't or once lived there can't use the space, cannot be directly beneficiaries of the jobs. Just a general statement of public good, even in the act of demolishing and displacing long-time residents, could be argued as a public good benefit. And that has been profoundly impactful to help give rise to the current landscape. So if you take together the reform of the Housing Act of 49 that came online in 54, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, and then you have the decision of Kelo versus the City of New London for rethinking eminent domain. These three laws and policies together were kind of the dangerous cabal that converged to give rise to the current landscape, where you have universities and their medical centers as these powerful, rapacious monsters, basically dressed up in public good language and public good visage, that are doing all of this work that demolishes or destroys our communities, and we aren't always able to even clearly see it because these are just schools.
Yeah, and it's very clear here in Baltimore where Hopkins has driven down property values in places where they are, and then gobbled up property, and now they own tons and tons of property all over the city, and they're putting their police force into place, which can patrol within a borderline of any of their properties. Well, that covers about 60% of the city, at that point. And it shows how much of an impact they have had and how much they've been able to benefit. But it's not just here, it's happening across the country.
Yes.
In places like this. I mean, I think Baltimore is particularly ripe for it. Black majority city that had significant political unrest that led to significant deindustrialization.
Right.
I think it left it particularly ripe, like many of the cities where this is happening.
Right.
I want to turn to sort of I think that's a good framing of the history of how we got here. And I'm interested in the now, like the confrontations with the now that are occurring, like what's happening right now in this space. And So I've been reading some of these Paul Gilroy conversations that he's been doing, and he often asked this question about sort of the balance of forces that are play in a given political conflict. So generally, what are the balance of forces at play in this struggle between universities and communities? And how powerful are the universities? How powerful are the forces against them? How is the right engaging this struggle? How are the liberals? Lots there to unpack, but
yeah, a lot. I mean, talking about the now is also a way for me to talk about kind of how I came into this work, and how my research became not just academic study but advocacy.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, this struggle is long. We could talk about the students and residents in Harlem who fought against Columbia building a university gymnasium in the middle of Morningside Park, and they charged Jim Crow, GYM Crow. We could talk about in West Philadelphia the efforts and the successful efforts on the part of a coalition amongst Drexel, University of Pennsylvania, and the hospitals to wipe out over 600 Black and brown families in West Philadelphia and create what today is University City. We can talk about the early beginnings of the displacement of communities and residents in East Baltimore that then would later become the East Baltimore Development Initiative that gave life to Eager Park. We can talk about in Denver, the demolition of primarily Chicano, what they were called then Chicano communities in the downtown core, right outside the central business district, to give life to the Aurora campus, which is 3 universities that continue to sit in the area. So all those historical forces give life to the present. The point that I'm making is that the very neighborhoods that were demolished are the sites for today's innovation districts, research parks that we are struggling with and against in this current moment. That today's innovation, that we can look at the towers of glass and steel and all of the construction cranes that are always surrounding university campus areas as they begin to expand and engulf across our entire cities. And we can say that formation is seated on the ground of demolition displacement that we talked about for the last 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And so in the current moment, what really brought the current struggles to life in a different way was after the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a number of people were talking about police abolition. Let's be clear, they weren't saying just no police. They were saying divest from armed carceral policing to invest in more life-giving, revitalizing public safety initiatives, healthcare, housing, food security, job security, trauma care, all these things.
Yeah, let the community handle accountability and rehabilitation instead of making it dependent on the criminal justice system.
Right. And on top of that, recognizing that police are not equipped. They've been given the responsibility of doing all these things while we've defunded all the social services. So we're saying, give the police a break. Let the institutions that are tasked and experts in these areas have funding to do this work instead of just dumping more millions into police forces and expecting them to do work they weren't trained in. So it's also that part of it. So the point is that during the period of calls for police abolition in the summer of 2020, people began to look around and say, wait a minute, who are the primary policers in my neighborhoods? It's actually not municipal police. It's not county sheriffs. It's campus police. And then people began to turn to my work. I had just written this book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower. And I talk about campus policing as this kind of front line for gentrification and hoarding of wealth and protecting of wealth on college campuses, and not about public safety at all. And so they began to turn to this work, and we began to build out these more comprehensive visions about analyzing, well, how do universities actually work as these dominant economic engines in the era where factories have moved to the global South, and higher education institutions in what we call the knowledge economy, which is primarily the, we don't make things anymore, so to speak, but what we do in America is what? We produce research and development and products in the areas of pharmaceuticals, software design, health services, military defense weaponry. Who does that work? Who provides the research and development for that work? What is the institutional anchor for that work? Colleges, universities, and their medical centers. So the point here is in today's economic climate, higher education institutions are at the center of what we call, without irony, the knowledge economy. And so this became a central focus of my work, highlight as a university professor, highlighting how these institutions are at the center of the economy. And you had these individual campaigns. You had residents fighting against campus police after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others. But you also began to see strike waves run wild across cities and communities that were being led by graduate students, contingent faculty workers that work at universities, low-wage support staff in the grounds crew, and safety, public, campus security, and cafeteria workers. You also had individuals who work on these campuses who were also getting their health care from university hospitals, but being sold market rate health care, even though universities were supposed to provide indigent care to surrounding communities. They were fighting against being exploited because universities, instead of letting communities know about the care they're supposed to provide in exchange for the tax exemptions, they were pursuing liens on the homes of these residents and workers at the university. They were garnishing the wages on their checks. And so again, these were individualized fights. At the same time, you had university police shooting and sometimes killing residents at contact zones like hospitals or at the area where the community met the campus. So you had individual fights against these various planks in university work, and they began to reach out to people like me because I was offering a comprehensive vision of how these aren't individual, anecdotal, accidental phenomena. They're actually part of a coordinated ecosystem of university economic development. They're part of a business plan. And so this is the larger, what you mentioned, forces at play that people found useful in my work to kind of offer a comprehensive mapping, not of just simply higher education, but of higher education as this critical, central, fulcrum, landing spot, convergence point for our political economy more broadly.
So especially in cities.
Yeah, go ahead.
Especially in cities, right? Like especially in cities,
right.
Especially in cities where these urban universities are the core economic engine, right? Like they're not extraneous to the conversation about economic justice. They're not extraneous to the conversation about racial justice. They're central to it in a place like Baltimore or in a place, in many of these places.
Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Haven, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, Denver, St. Louis, Berkeley, California, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, New Mexico. The list goes on and on and on. And not just cities, but also small towns that have become college towns.
Mm-hmm.
So as secondary urban locales when major cities become unaffordable. So this is what we might call in radical frames, a world historical moment.
Yeah. And the world historical moment is recognizing how these different individualized struggles are connected together as part of a struggle to reorient us toward democracy, peace, and justice. And I think we're in a moment where an intense moment of possibility, even within the limits of the current political system. And I want to go through some of these specific instances that you've mentioned and talk about the localized struggle and what it means for the larger picture. We'll do that with a couple of places. Let's start with New Haven.
Yeah, New Haven. So this is how I want to tell a story real quickly. When the book first came out, and I said I wanted this to be basically, I had so much data on all these cities I studied, talk about this convergence between higher education and urban and economic development. And it was community driven. It was community focused. The book was driven by over 150 interviews. But I felt like if you want to understand how a university works within the economic sphere, center those who are most impacted by it. And that's not faculty. It's not students. It's workers and residents. Mm-hmm. So that was the driver of the book. And a brother was coming out of prison in Philadelphia, and he read the book and was like, "Brother, this is my life. I grew up in the Black Bottom that became University City in West Philadelphia, and no one has told the story in this way. But we your information sharing is great, but brother, we need your help. We need your advocacy." Not shortly after that, I was reached out by New Haven Rising, which is an amazing in New Haven, Connecticut, the home of Yale University, which is New Haven Rising is this amazing coalition of not only students and residents, but local radical alderpersons. So this is like city councilors that came together, and they've been going on for like about 40 years with different names. And they had put together in 2021 and 2022 a Yale Pay Your Fair Share campaign. Because if you don't know, what pays for things like public schools, fire, trash removal, snow removal,
Property
public
tax.
infrastructure, property taxes. So if you live in a city like New Haven, Connecticut, or Baltimore, Maryland, and the biggest landowners and low-wage employers in your area are universities, well, university, as I said before, university properties, because they're presumed to be a public good, a nonprofit, those properties are tax exempt. Now, this arrangement has been in existence for decades. But as universities attempt to become more entrepreneurial and figure out ways to monetize more aspects of their footprint and of their teaching and learning, the tax exemption of their campus land has become profoundly lucrative to the detriment of the host communities. And so this is a moment where New Haven, Connecticut realized that this is the reason why their schools are struggling. This is the reason why their city budget isn't balanced, because the biggest property holder in their city is Yale University, which is also the biggest low-wage employer, which is also the biggest healthcare provider, which also has a police force that has jurisdiction because of a memorandum of understanding between the city and the university. Yale PD has jurisdiction over the entire city. So not just campus affiliates, but everyday residents can be policed by Yale PD, and the police department is armed, right? Yeah. So this phenomena is real, but the Yale Pay Your Fair Share campaign was primarily focused on the property tax exemption, saying, Yale, you need to pay taxes. Now, to be clear, Yale University already pays the biggest, what we call a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes amongst universities in the country, which is at 14, which at the time was about $12 million a year. Big numbers, big dollars. But the Yale Pay Your Fair Share campaign did the number. They said, well, if you think about how much property they own, let's calculate for a minute. Take that $14 million aside. If Yale was a private company, they would owe an additional $157 million on the properties that they own. Not let alone their $40 billion endowment, which is also tax exempt. So in 2021 and 2022, they engaged in a series of actions at a time when COVID said you could not organize. They organized. They engaged in a 600-car caravan that snaked through downtown, and then at rush hour, they stopped. They stopped traffic. Then shortly thereafter, they reached out to me and they said what we talked about earlier. We're talking about the property taxes, but what your work does is that it situates Yale and other schools within this larger ecosystem where we can understand, and I wrote about Yale in the book, where we can understand its healthcare, its labor conditions. And also that's another important, critical part of New Haven Rising, is that it was driven by Unite Here, which is the labor union. Mighty Unite Here 33 and 34. And those are my strong comrades, people like Eddie Camp and others. So it was driven, it was the spine for that was United Here. But they said, that with your work, we can situate this property tax struggle with the labor struggle, with our frustrations with the healthcare and the policing. Because New Haven is a mid-sized city, all these issues were tied to Yale: housing, healthcare, policing, labor, quality of life, and on top of that, political governance. Because Yale is so powerful, the things that their interests are dictate the interests of local government. And so we engaged in a campaign in 2022 of rallies, teach-ins, artwork, music, food. One time I was there and I looked around with my mask on and we were chanting at the university. And I was like, well, wait a minute. We right here with children and students and music and flyers and teach-ins, I realized we are building the better university here in the shadows of this $40 billion behemoth. The university is here. And so I was able to help marshal our journalistic friends from Time Magazine, the American City Business Journal, and others, and we were able to gain a national audience for this struggle. And they were ultimately able to bring Yale to the table of City Hall and come to a new agreement that has them paying an additional $52 million over the next 6 years in additional tax compensation. And when other communities saw that, they said, we need another New Haven. So that put me on a tour to, Denver and Berkeley and Miami and back to Philadelphia and St. Louis. Currently, I am in Durham, North Carolina, because they want to initiate a pilot payments in lieu of taxes campaign in the Research Triangle with North Carolina State and Duke and UNC Chapel Hill and all the other, and NC Central, all the other schools that are in this area that have made this area extremely unaffordable. A couple of years ago, they tried to push for a light rail system. Duke, with its political power, said, well, we need a stop on our campus. I think that they realized that made their campus more accessible. And in the 11th hour, they put a kibosh on the light rail. So talk about the power that these institutions have, not just in terms of their physical footprint, but because of that, their power to control public services and planning decisions. Because this triangle is so lucrative and it brought a number of researchers and faculty and students to the area, it displaced a long-standing Black and brown communities. This used to be a majority Black area, the Research Triangle. They've been pushed to the periphery. And so the light rail was also seen as an act of racial justice to bring Black and brown people back into the city to do the work of cleaning the cafeterias and the laboratories and serving the food and being able to, those who couldn't afford to live there, to either travel back into the cities in the campuses, or to also create affordable housing at transit hubs around the light rail infrastructure. And it was Duke, right? A university that had the power to say no, to stop it. So we're here now trying to build out another pilot campaign because of the inspiration of what happened in New Haven. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is so inspiring, and it sets that victory as a hint of the future that we can have, and it helps us to see the ways that we can organize and seize these powers and redirect the power. And I think the point you make about control over the politicians is a really interesting one, because if you're in a city like Baltimore or in a city like Durham, your folks that are elected don't come from intergenerational wealth. They don't come from tons of money. And if you have a force that is giving maximum campaign donations wherever they can, that's going to exert power. If I remember when the Hopkins police force passed the Maryland General Assembly, $28,000 or something like that got donated.
From seven sources, 7 individuals that were all. And I think almost all of them were tied to Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, and it's like you can't pretend that doesn't speak, right? Like they wouldn't do it if it didn't give them power. And I think that in a lot of these cities where the university, they're mostly working class cities, or working, like in Baltimore, where most of our electeds are working class Black and brown folks, maybe middle class Black and brown folks. They are, Dr. Lawrence Brown in his book, The Black Butterfly, talks about the way that those politicians are not the ones with the real power. The folks like Hopkins and University of Maryland are the ones with the real power. And you look at the University of Maryland medical system scandal with our past mayor, Catherine Pugh. And again, look, it is the mayor. It's not the mayor who has the power there. It's the medical system who's giving her hundreds of thousands of shady dollars and shady and corrupt donations. And
you can bring in an individual like Michael Bloomberg, to pump almost $1 billion into campaigns, and then in the public say, I support Hopkins Police Force. So of course, lawmakers and politicians are going to listen to that because, like you said, either politicians are not from intergenerational wealth, and so they don't have that kind of influence, or they are alums of
Right.
those institutions, and they see their interests more aligned with the institution than they do those who they've been elected to represent.
Exactly. And I think that that's the value of building the power arrayed against building alternative forces of power to array against those universities. I want to skip a little bit to the meantime and in the future, you know, and reading abolition work. I think there's a really useful concept of like, yes, we want a future in which there is no policing or no carceral policing, but we have work to do in the meantime in order to be able to protect communities and ensure that they're safe. And I think that framing helps me to understand a little bit of like what I want to talk about next, which is what do we do about this piece of this?
Yes.
And so on April 14th, you're doing an event at the University of Wisconsin called What Will It Take to Free Higher Education from Its Current Conditions?
Yes.
I like the theme of this. And I think the first question I want to ask here is, what does it mean to win? What does the free in that title look like for a university?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm a firm, in the spirit of Black studies, I am a firm advocate of building what I call the abolition university. And this is what I mean by freeing the university from its current conditions. Abolition, I don't mean, it means like in you think about prison abolition, it means the end of prisons. I don't take that position, the end of university. And some people do, let's be clear. What I mean is freeing higher education from its current conditions, because when I talk to community groups all over the country and increasingly in the world, they are proud of these institutions being in their backyards and the kind of influence they curry. But they're saying, listen, we want the cafeterias, we want the laboratories, we want the Wi-Fi, we want the lecture halls, we want the museums, we want all these things, but to be in service to the communities that make them possible by working on these campuses, by providing our taxes to these institutions, by living in a state that gives them a charter for their very existence. This is what we want, a new relationship. What does that mean in tangible terms? It means that when we think about something like policing, campus policing, if there's any entity, any sector in America that can actually engage in police abolition today, it is higher education. Because the research shows, and this is policing more broadly, that 9 out of 10 police calls do not require an armed response. The research also shows that true forms of public safety are not armed police that react to crime and harm, but it's preventative acts of food security, housing security, job training, healthcare, trauma care. These are the things that ensure or have a greater capacity to ensure safety, community safety. What entity in our communities is best equipped to provide housing, food, trauma care, job training? The entities that claim to provide those entities, those aspects anyway. Higher education. Johns Hopkins Medical boasts as having the #1 medical institution in the world. Now, I work with Social Mission Alliance. I'm here at their conference right now, a group of progressive medical professionals and students and educators. And I'm speaking as a keynote tomorrow, and I'm going to say this tomorrow as well. And we're trying to put together a dashboard that measures what social good academic medical centers are actually providing to their communities. And we say, how can Johns Hopkins Medical boast about how can it be the #1 medical center in the world when it sits in the middle of an East Baltimore with the health disparities that it currently endures? How's that possible? So we're saying that the ranking and prestige of an institution must be predicated on the health conditions of where it sits. We argue for campus police abolition. What we mean by that is divest in carceral armed response and invest in true public safety. We argue for community-based zoning and planning boards. That if a university is going to expand into our community, there must be a division within the planning and zoning offices of our cities that have oversight and enforcement powers to veto or approve any expansions to the degree that it serves the community. We believe that any development must be governed by a community benefits agreement that includes things like community land trust, that includes things like zip code specific work job training programs and contracts and procurement contracts for small businesses from zip code specific areas. Because we know that when you say citywide, universities are going to find the whitest and wealthiest neighborhoods to support, like they always have. We also argue for organized labor protections across the board. We call what I call the new shop floor, wall-to-wall labor protections from tenured faculty down to the janitorial staff and students. So these are just a couple of things that we mean. And of course, we argue for the return to free education and open admissions. This is what we mean by an abolition university, where the entity is in service to the community that makes it possible. And let's be honest, the old economic model of just simply targeting the white, wealthy, middle-class families that can full pay colleges, that model is dying because those families are not having babies. Right. So who's left? It's the Pell-eligible Black, brown, and poor white kids that are carrying federal money with them to campuses that are going to be the foundation for the future of higher education. And if higher education continues to be the economic foundation for our cities, it's the future of our economic engine. So if we invest in those communities, higher education is going to have to look different. When you build out with campus expansions, we argue 40% of that development must include affordable housing at 40 to 60% AMI, not 80 to 120%. And all the things I'm telling you, they're not made up. They're not speculative. They're actually rooted in the origins of Black studies in the 60s and 70s, that when students were fighting for Black studies, they weren't just arguing for the diversification of faculty and curriculum. They actually argued these housing questions, these labor questions, these open admissions questions from the beginning. Now, of course, I've retooled and expanded based on the new economy, but the core values of a university that serves structural needs as higher education moved to the center of the economy, that was foreshadowed, that was foreseen, that was forewarned by the rise of Black studies and ethnic studies in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this. I love that tying together of it and that framing of it, because the idea that we need to take the university and move it from an extractive, profit-driven relationship to a constructive, people-driven relationship feels really powerful to me. And I love the linking of it back to Black studies, because in a lot of ways, I think the right in their attack on higher education knows exactly what they're doing.
Oh, yeah.
They know the power of scholarship like yours. They know the teaching and the power of teaching and advocacy like you and your colleagues in Black studies across the country. And they want to shut it down. They want to delegitimize it because they know it's powerful. They know that critique is valuable. Go ahead.
I'll do you one better. Not just the critique. They understand the power of higher education as an economic gold mine. Mm-hmm. And so while they're telling us, and many of us are believing it, now listen, people, if you're listening, they're telling you higher education is bankrupt, it's dead, don't invest, become an entrepreneur on your own. While they're saying that to you, they're also saying at New College in Florida, we are over the walls, using military language, saying we have seized control of higher education. So when they're telling you to turn your backs away from it, they are taking control of it. Because, as you said, they understand the power of what they call woke, DEI, whatever, but they also understand higher education as this powerful convergence point for labor, for intellectual property, for real estate, for policing, for healthcare. It's both and.
They understand the same thing that Reagan understood. Mm-hmm. And they're drawing from the same intellectual tradition, and they understand the same thing, and they're using 2024 tactics to do it. And I think that part of it is so important, because I think that I think there's a liberal and neoliberal tendency to avoid confrontation with them on this argument, to sort of try to sidestep the right. And I think the real left and the grassroots communities need to confront the right and make a case for seizing the power of the university and turning it toward the good of the people and toward the good of the communities. And I think you lay out a really good vision of how that looks, not just what we want to get to, but what to do in the meantime.
That's right.
And that list of things you just listed there, all of those are policy things that should be easily available to,
something. Just give you another example. Something as simple as every day, because of health code restrictions or health code protections, university cafeterias throw out tons of food. I said at a meeting with UPenn medical students, what would it mean to just simply take that food and repackage it into healthy meals of need and healthy meals for communities in need in the surrounding communities? No university, I say this all the time, no university ever took me up on it. One student, a medical student, with all the work that they have to do to get through medical school, he took me up on this and organized with Black and brown women in the cafeterias and the local DSA, Democratic Socialists of America chapter in Philadelphia. And on Fridays, they take the food that's going to get thrown away, they repackage it. They bought it on Amazon, I'm endorsing Amazon, but they bought a couple of coolers for their bicycles, and they take those meals, repackage them, and send them to community centers all throughout West Philadelphia. Just imagine if university would lean into these things and scale these things up, what kind of transformation we could have with these other. So the things I'm talking about are not even about destroying or tearing down. My analysis is actually quite modest, talking about things universities can do within the current infrastructures, they can still thrive. And I'm saying to university, if you don't listen to me, there are people beside me that are saying, just tear this shit down, right? But communities actually want these universities. Right. And let's be clear, I've been asked to come on Fox News a couple of times because they see my critique and like, oh, he's on our side. He can critique universities with us and he's Black. This is great. But then when they read my solutions, then they stop calling.
Yeah, I would imagine they do. And, I think that point about like people want to work at the university, but they want to have a good union job at the university.
Right.
It's not that they wish the university weren't there. It's that they wish that the university would use its billions of dollars in endowment in order to make sure that every worker had a living wage and good benefits.
That's right.
That's right. And it's like that part about it, I think, was really useful in 2018 when I was knocking on doors in the footprint of Hopkins and talking to all sorts of folks. It wasn't we want the university gone. It was we wish it would do its part. We wish it would be constructive instead of extractive.
And that's an important point. That number one, a key piece that we cannot forget is the state divestment, federal, government divestment. That's critical. But number two is that since we have, not we, but society and the political economy has given higher education this central role in our economic development, then we must treat these institutions as such. Then we must demand collective bargaining. We must demand that if the state chart, each university, public and private, Johns Hopkins included, they only exist because they've been given existence by a state charter. We, the people, bring these entities into existence, public and private. We could actually demand a revocation of the state charter because the institutions failed to serve the state. As especially private schools move away from how many public universities, private universities like Hopkins, how many Baltimore residents attend that school? How many Maryland residents attend that school, even though they come into existence because of a state charter? We could ask the question. We could create a referendum on this because of the economic equations. They are trying to attract out-of-state residents, international students who pay more, and they are betraying their state mandate, their state charter. And so this is, again, as you said, just within the promises and the requirements that currently exist, these entities could do and be more and be better.
Exactly. And I think that push to make them better as opposed to make them go away, I think is the real value. But they also can't continue to operate as they can. It feels to me like there are sort of three camps to this. The neoliberal camp is like, all is good, let's move forward, we're making money. The right wing camp is trying to take over the university to serve right wing purposes.
Yeah.
And there seems to be until the emergence of some of this work that you're doing, I think some of the grad student organizing, I think the balance of forces that are coming together are starting to create a left approach to this. And I guess we have a couple of other questions, but we're getting close on time. Do you think that this creates an opening for different types of political arrangements and different types of political orders? This movement, let me put it this way. Do you think that the failure of elected Democrats in most of these cities to come to grips with the way the university, to side with the people instead of the universities, creates openings for different types of political arrangements than the ones that exist right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this on the ground, and it's really at the local level, even more importantly than the federal level, because you now have because of these gaps, you have party, people that are not saying it in private anymore, but people saying, I'm a member of DSA. I'm a member of the Green Party. I'm calling for reparations. I'm calling for economic redistribution. Even though all the red baiting and black baiting around woke and DEI, you have a third rail, a third approach, a third way, if you will, to go back to the 60s and 70s, a third way of thinking about these things. And even though it's not fully coordinated, a lot of the issues that they are coming together around are these things that are solidifying around the concentration of power and wealth on these campuses and other nonprofits. So when I was working with in Ithaca, New York, with around Cornell paying more pilot, it was the DSA that brought me in, Democratic Socialists of America. When I've worked with other communities in St. Louis and other places, it's Black and brown folks who are calling for reparations, the reparations movement. And so whatever you want to call it, you're beginning to see a new vision for a new set of political arrangements. Like, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Wisconsin. And, my grandfather was a UAW member who worked at a car plant. And in certain ways, he was virulently conservative. But if you asked him about healthcare, he said it should be universal. If you asked him about labor, he believed in the right to organize. If you asked him about food, there should be no food deserts. On the bread and butter issues, he was socialist.
Yep.
Right.
And I think one of the things that has happened since the Clinton era is the Democrats have moved away from the sort of materiality toward sort of an identity politics that strips materiality out of it as their bread and butter. And that doesn't work in the context of these clashes around universities that are hoarding wealth and power. And I think and look, that's not all Democrats, but the party, the National Party and its messaging have moved in that direction. And I think a lot of folks like your grandfather have been looking for an alternative solution that is going to be focused on justice, that is going to be rooted in communities, and is going to say, yes, of course, everybody should have health care, everybody should have a living wage. This isn't even like a question of debate, right? Right.
That's right. And so we're also we're partnering with an organization called Mass Action for Pilots, which is the Massachusetts Action for Pilots, because Massachusetts is such a college state and Boston is such a college town. And they're doing some really innovative things, and we can talk about it later, or we can talk on Twitter or whatever, people that are listening, to go into more detail about it. But my main point here is that in a lot of these campaigns where you have kind of progressive or liberal whites who are pushing these initiatives, they're using the data of disparity in Black and brown communities, but they don't bring along Black and brown people in their leadership. And so what that looks like in Massachusetts is that the small little towns around Boston or in Boston elite neighborhoods are talking about pilots, are talking about redistribution, but they're using statistics from Roxbury and Mattapan, red, Black and brown neighborhoods to do their work. But my work came in as a bridge saying that if you're going to use this data, you got to start meeting in Roxbury and organizing with Roxbury residents. And also you got to bring in, say, maybe middle to less left groups like the NAACP,
right,
and push them left. And so now we met this past year at the NAACP local chapter in Roxbury, Massachusetts, for this Mass Action for Pilots, bringing together liberal whites, progressive whites, Black communities, and the national NAACP has gotten put onto this phenomena, and they now are saying, wow, this issue around taxation and economic justice around universities, they're thinking about, and I want them to hear this because they're still considering it. We want to push them forward, to making this one of their core civil rights agenda issues for the 21st century. And I think this is how we have to move forward, that even our traditional ways of looking at politics have to be infused with this content and outlook to push our political campaigns and our visions forward in a different way.
Again, yeah, to me, totally, like constructive political projects that are building new institutions that can change outcomes.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
To me, that's what it's about. It's, and for me, I choose a green label to do that under because I think it represents my values. But like at the end of the day, it is about new political arrangements that can create realignments that allow us to get different outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of green, what does it mean that most of the Black and brown workers who once lived around campuses now are pushed further to the hinterlands of the metropolis that have been thoroughly divested? So to put workforce housing, affordable housing on these expansive campuses, that is a carbon footprint issue. That is a racial justice issue. That is an economic development issue. That this is a green issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of different ways, right? Like the food waste issue that you talked about is the same thing. It's like because if it's not going to people, it's going to a landfill.
That's right. And in my book, I talk about the University of Winnipeg and some of the innovative things they've done. And they at one point in time had a contract with one of the horrible food campus multinationals, Aramark, Sodexo, Chartwells, all the names, where you spend like $15 for a chicken sandwich. They fired them and created their own company called Diversity Foods. And one of the key things they do is that they receive 70% of their raw materials for their cafeteria from small family farms within a 100-kilometer radius of that campus. They have a compost bin next to every workstation in their in their workspace, which I've seen. And they take their cooking oil and send it out to be converted into biodiesel. This is a campus as a major economic engine, but again, foreshadowing, leading a green vision of sustainability, as they would say, that is not just about LEED certified buildings, it's economic, it's political, and it's cultural, because the campus is surrounded by what they call new Canadians, we call immigrants, and First Nations people, because the province of Manitoba has the biggest First Nations population in North America. So for them, sustainability means that because First Nations communities live around our campuses, we have to push forward housing, labor, visions that allow those communities to sustain themselves and their culture in these communities as we develop and grow. This is a green vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so much to explore on this, and I'm pretty sure we could keep talking for another hour, but I know we both have other things to get to. So, and definitely, I would love to have you back. I'd love to continue these conversations. The campaign is going to be focusing over the summer on some of our higher education policies and plans for the state of Maryland, and I'd love any input you have on that. And we'll share with you on that. But before we go, is there anything you want to leave us with? Any final parting words?
Yeah. First of all, if you're in Baltimore in May, come through. University of Maryland, Baltimore. Please come through. First of all, I'll say that, and I will leave you with this, that as we look around this current landscape, this is not something we don't know. The insights that I had came from and driven by people that live and endure these conditions all day long, and it's in their wisdom, in their stories, in their experiences that we find the path for a different and better way. That we have to do away with the myth of the schoolhouse. These schools will tell you, right, that they will engage and invest and rampage across your communities, and then when you fight back, they say, "Wait, we're just a schoolhouse," right? But these institutions set the wage ceilings for our communities. They set the land values for our communities. They control the health standards for our communities. And they dictate the policing priorities for our communities. So no longer can we understand higher education institutions as simply the training ground for the future. We have to understand them as the staging ground for either rapacious exploitation or for the democratic possibilities of our current conditions. I'll
Excellent.
leave you with that.
That is a great way to leave it. I will be promoting the May 1st event left and right. So check out my socials for that. And then how do people get in touch with you? How do they follow your work?
You can follow me, Davarian.Baldwin at trendcall.edu. Yes, I'm giving you my email. Don't be crazy. Or I'm on Twitter at Davarian Baldwin.
Excellent.
And follow the work of the Smart Cities Research Lab that I pointed out before. We've been doing the work. We're now trying to build out the infrastructure. There will be a website soon, but we're in any city you might be in. We're there. We're probably there, or we're going to be there doing the work. If you need us, reach out. We're happy to convene, to work with you. I'm currently right now in Durham, North Carolina, doing the work. I will be in Baltimore doing the work. I will be in Sacramento in the middle of May doing the work. So let's just do the work together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to continue doing this work with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you May 1st. And I really appreciated this hour. It was wonderful. And I wish we had more time to now, but we'll do it at another time. So
thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you. So this was a great episode. I was really excited to get to talk to Professor Baldwin on this. It was a fantastic discussion, and I think it's really important. I think it fits in the context of a set of discussions that we're having about higher education here in Maryland. We talked to somebody from a Hopkins labor union last week. In the coming weeks, we're going to talk to people from HBCUs, community colleges, and state of Maryland colleges, because higher education is one of the key economic engines in Maryland, and we need to understand how to make it be constructive for the communities and the people that we live in. So this conversation was great, and it is part of a series of conversations that we're talking about higher education. Next week's episode is going to dive a little bit more, the next episode is going to dive a little bit more into multi-party democracy, a little bit of a swerve. We're going to be talking to Jack Santucci, who wrote the book More Parties or No, the book about the history of political reform in the U.S., More Parties or No Parties. And I'm really looking forward to that. But this was a great conversation. Thank you all for it, and I'm excited to keep the dialogue going and come out May 1st to see Davarian Baldwin in person.